Okay, so welcome everyone. So thank you for joining me on this Saturday. So before we start, I just wanted to briefly introduce myself. So my name is Zachary, and today I'm going to present an article that I worked on between 2019 and I actually finished in 2022 when I was in grad school. And I used to study politics, religion, and sex in horror films, which are all really fun topics. So this presentation is going to look specifically at The Conjuring and its sequel. And I hope that by the end of the presentation, I'll make you want to analyze the media you consume very closely. So just before we get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to go over some content warnings here. So the first is that there will be heavy spoilers for The Conjuring and The Conjuring 2, so I hope that you have already watched them. Since this is a presentation that is dealing with horror and scary imageries, then there will be some like scary and horror sort of pictures and stuff like that, so just to be aware of that. And there will also be discussions about abortion, self-harm, and sexual abuse. It will come up a couple of times throughout the presentation, so I will try to warn you about them beforehand. So if you're sensitive to these topics, you will be able to mute. And there's also going to be discussions about hateful rhetoric. So this can go from anywhere from homophobia, transphobia, to anti-Semitism, to racism and misogyny. So as we're talking about conservative Christianity in the United States, these topics are quite unavoidable. So the idea of such a paper came to me when I first encountered this article by Vice titled, "Why Are So Many Horror Movies Christian Propaganda?" And essentially, in the article, Josiah Hesse talks a lot about how horror films dealing with Christian beliefs are often very conservative and they try to convert its viewers by using fear tactics. So Hesse talks about horror films such as The Conjuring and The Omen pictured here as espousing the same messaging as conservative Christian media, kind of like in line with Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, for an example, or if you've seen Evangelical produced films like God's Not Dead or Unplanned, those as well. So for me, this article was definitely on to something when Hesse talks about horror films essentially being mouthpieces to conservative Christian politics. However, I find the word propaganda here is a bit clickbaity, so I won't be using it in my presentation. But I did see truth in the way in which religious horror films, especially like The Conjuring, borrows heavily from Christian fiction and Christian politics to construct its message. And specifically, I want to argue in this presentation that The Conjuring and its sequel heavily adopt Christian nationalist ideology and function as evangelical horror fiction made for a bigger audience. So now you might be asking yourself, what is Christian nationalist ideology? Well, the short answer would be whatever is happening currently in the United States. But if you're looking for more of a detailed definition, I particularly like Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry's definition. So, in their book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, they describe Christian nationalism as a cultural framework, a collection of myths, traditions, and symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealized and advocated a fusion of Christianity with American civic life, end quote. So, put simply, Christian nationalism is the belief that a particular nation, and in this case, the United States, should be a conservative Christian nation. So, for Whitehead and Perry, Christian nationalism, while it might seem as a religious ideology at first, is far more interested in the political. And this is why, when polling Christian nationalists in the United States, we often see a greater emphasis placed on political policies rather than religious doctrines, even when they seemingly go against Christian teachings. So, this might explain why many white evangelicals have continued to support Donald Trump and his policies, even when many of the things he says goes against Christian teachings. One such example would be that he is, I think, 2 times divorced. So now that we have a better understanding of Christian nationalism, then you might be asking who specifically is pushing this ideology. And I would say that the most prominent one, the most prominent group, would be the Christian right. So, ever since the Democratic Party in the US abandoned its southern base, conservative Christians, especially white evangelicals, felt politically homeless until Richard Nixon became the president in the 1970s. Popular televangelists such as Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell vocally supported Nixon and encouraged their followers to do the same. Falwell even created the Moral Majority, which was a group of conservative Christians that advocated for pro-life and anti-gay policies. The Moral Majority would then later coalesce into what we call now the Christian right. So today, the group generally consists of conservative Baptists, Pentecostals, and other charismatic Christians, as well as conservative Catholics. Like the moral majority, though, the Christian right aims to support Republican candidates that believe in Christian nationalist policies, with the ultimate goal to transform the US into a Christian nation. So they want this nation to be governed solely by conservative Christian morality, such as anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ laws, anti-pornography laws, anti-gun control, anti-diversity, and the reintroducing of creationism and public schools creationism and prayers in public schools. So if you have been closely following US politics, and I really don't blame you if you haven't, you might have seen talks about critical race theory or LGBT teachers, quote unquote, grooming children in public schools. Both of these topics are quite ridiculous in their own rights, because like no one is really teaching graduate level theories to children, and LGBTQ teachers are not quote unquote grooming children simply by existing or having pictures of their partners in their classroom. Um, and while these topics might not seem inherently Christian nationalists at first, these are the topics that are being used by the Christian right as an example of a lost nation absent of Christian morals. So I believe in order to understand exactly what The Conjuring and its sequel is doing in terms of its messaging, we have to understand the religious and political landscape of the early 2000s. And there's quite a lot of events that are relevant here, but I'll try to stick to the main ones. So the first one we have is the turn of the millennium politics and sort of the end of the world craze. So scholar Lynn Schofield Clark highlights in her book From Angels to Aliens, Teenagers, the Media, and the Supernatural that the supernatural evil was of great concern during the turn of the millennium. And many attributed the tragedies and anxieties that happened during this time to the supernatural. So if you're old enough to remember, you might remember the Y2K panic, which was essentially the belief that the world would end on the night of December 31st, 1999. The sort of the myth goes that since software was built in the 1900s, uh, it would have trouble going from 1999 to 2000. And sort of many white evangelicals believed that this was the end times and they prepared accordingly. So a lot of them stocked up on food, they stocked up on money and cash as well. So, secondly, we also have the 1999 Columbine school shooting, which was really the first school shooting to make massive waves in the US. And white evangelicals were quick to attribute supernatural causes such as devil worship. So by that time, evangelicals had already kind of linked horror movies, video games, and role-playing games, pornography, goth aesthetics, heavy metal, rock music, all to the devil. And then the saying goes like engaging with these things could unlock portals to hell and corrupt the youth. And a lot of them believe that it could corrupt them so bad that they would actually engage in school shootings. But probably the biggest one is no doubt the 9/11 attacks and the disastrous war on terror that preceded it, which was waged by then President George W. Bush at the time. So during this era, many white evangelicals, including Bush himself, were linking the war on terror with the supernatural. So Bush constantly framed the US as the quote unquote good guys, handpicked by Jesus himself to fight this holy war against the forces of evil in Iraq. And in her brilliant book, The Babylon Complex, Theopolitical Fantasies of War, Sex, and Sovereignty, Aaron Runnings explains that the dominant understanding of the war was that of the biblical texts becoming reality. So all the biblical passages about good versus evil for evangelicals were believed to be actually realized before our very eyes. However, when the Obama era ushered in 2008, white evangelicals ultimately lost. Um, but unfortunately, they only got stronger. So the Christian right was very frustrated by the defeat, and they started to court other conservative Republican groups as their influence was declining. They eventually became allies with a new emerging conservative group. So the war-loving, fear-mongering, libertarian Tea Party movement. And the Tea Party movement, which essentially could now be just called like the MAGA movement, or basically they've all become kind of Trump's base at this point. But they did start out as being extremely focused on economic policies. Their slogan, as one of them, as you can see on screen, Freedom for America. They essentially believed in less government power and oversight. And at first, they didn't really talk about social policies until they met the Christian right, that is. And by that time, it seemed to be sort of the perfect combination. So by adopting the Tea Party's conservative economic policies, the Christian right could be relevant again in a Republican Party where right-wing economic policies were resonating with everyday Americans. But on the other hand, by adopting conservative Christian issues like anti abortion, anti gay policies, the Tea Party could reach a new voter base while getting them on board with their economic policies. So, all in all, it seemed like a win win situation for both groups. So while the political landscape for conservative Christians were morphing and gaining momentum, evangelical media was also on the rise in popularity. So this is important to understanding the Conjuring. So like apocalyptic books like Tim LaHaye's The Left Behind series were coming very mainstream, coming out of evangelical circles. The provocative hell houses were popping up all around America, and the popular chick tracts were at an all-time high. And not only were conservative Christian politics on the rise, but conservative Christian media was also reaching many people. So then what is evangelical horror fiction? Well, it's a genre of religious fiction that not only tries to cater to conservative Christians themselves, but to a broader audience with the goal to convert its audience using horror tropes and fear tactics. So within evangelical horror fiction, horror becomes sort of this powerful tool used to generate fearful responses and tap into cultural anxieties. Kendall R. Phillips, in his book Projected Fears, Horror Films and American Culture, argues that horror cinema has always both resonated with the broader cultural anxieties of the time. So let's think of Cold War, 9/11, and I would say most recently, the fear surrounding trans people in public bathrooms. But horror doesn't just resonate with the broader cultural anxieties. It also violates specific cultural norms, according to Phillips. So I'll use an example directly from Phillips. So basically, he says that John Carpenter's Halloween, you have the killer Michael Myers, who becomes a kind of moral boogeyman that punishes sexually deviant teenagers with the goal of returning to an idealized 1960s culturally conservative lifestyle. So, in essence, you have the idea of the 1970s as being very liberal. You have the sexual liberation, you have civil rights movements, you have this idea of free love and the hippie movement as well, which the world of John Carpenter's Halloween basically showcases. But then you have Michael Myers, who becomes the sort of boogeyman that punishes this cultural norm. So essentially, he violates that norm. So if horror cinema resonates and violates with the cultural norms, then it's not hard to see how religion might fit into the equation. So, horror scholar of religion Douglas E. Cowan showcases that horror films tend to use religious symbols to prey on anxieties of individuals' inherent religious selves. So, essentially, although we might not be religious ourselves, we fear the unknown. And I'll ask you some questions here. Like, are you certain that the devil doesn't exist? And what happens if he is and is watching our every move? Does the Christian God exist? And if so, is he truly as benevolent as we all believe? What about ghosts? Is it possible that we do not have all the answers? And these are the types of questions that evangelical horror fiction loves to grapple with because there's no concrete answers to them. Evangelical horror fiction is able to imagine a world where demons and devils and ghosts and goblins live among us. So, although evangelical horror fiction is a broad genre with many different writers, with many different religious beliefs, they all share common cliches and tropes. So, Kenneth Paradis states that the evangelicals have a shared evangelical imagination, meaning that the fiction they write shares common politics, religious beliefs, story beats and topics, narrative cliches, and writing styles. And I'll highlight some of the more common themes here, and you might recognize some from earlier slides. So, the first one is the use of taboo subject matter to garner fear. Then there's this idea of a holy war, right, fought between good and evil. We have the anti-gay and anti-abortion rhetoric, and finally, the conversion tactics. So let's look at some examples a bit closer. So the first one here we have is the chick tracts, and you might have already encountered chick tracts in your daily lives, and you just really didn't pay much attention to it. I know that these are very popular in the United States, and I have seen some in Canada as well, but I'm not sure if they're really popular in other parts of the world. Um, on their website, they do claim that they are the world's one of the most popular religious tracts in the world, but I don't know if it's just them exaggerating or not. But either way, these chick tracts are first and foremost religious tracts that are left in public places where people are to pick them up, read them, and the idea is that through its very powerful message, be converted. However, what makes them one of the most popular religious tracts is that they are essentially tiny Christian comic strips that tell horror stories about how we will all burn in hell if we do not accept Jesus as our personal Lord and Savior. And within the pages of the chick tracts lies many horror tropes, such as serial killers, monsters, graphic body horror, murder, and even the end of the world. So on screen here, I have but two frames from the chick track titled Party Girl. So the story of this track goes that the devil and his minions, pictured here in kind of like a council setting, a shadowy group, are planning to infiltrate a New Orleans party by planting drugs and alcohol and demonic music. And then we meet this very Christian grandmother who is praying for her granddaughter who is out partying in the streets and drinking alcohol. And then you see the demons actively influencing her to drink and party. And it's even suggested that she's about to be sexually assaulted until the power of the grandmother's prayers defeat the demon. So the granddaughter, feeling embarrassed, flees the party. And she has this sinking feeling that she needs to go see her grandmother. And when she arrives, her grandmother is relieved. She thanks God for saving her daughter. And then goes on this spiel about the story of Jesus and sort of educates her granddaughter about the life of Jesus. And the chick track ends like they all do, and it's with a personal affirmation that you can read that states essentially that you have to accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. Now, the Hell House is essentially a Halloween haunted house experience that brings to life the stories we often see in chick tracks. However, they are in a theatrical form this time. So the Hell House is often something that is created and funded by white evangelical churches, and they follow a basic room to room format, like a basic Halloween haunted house. So most of them feature very dark and sometimes even disturbing plays about queer people dying of AIDS, graphic abortions, drug abuse, sexual abuse, and even suicide. And I have to say that some of the things shown in the 2001 documentary Hell House is more disturbing and shocking than many Hollywood horror movies. So, content warning here for both abortion, sexual abuse, and self harm. I will show a picture on screen from a scene from Hell House, which depicts like a pretend or a fake abortion. So, if you are sensitive to this, you might want to mute or and look away from the screen. So, the first scene is here, pictured here, is sort of the abortion scene. This is a very popular scene within the Hell House, and uh, most Hell Houses that are created have an abortion scene similar to this. So in this scene in the film, we see that this pregnant teen girl has killed, and I'm using these words because the documentary uses these words. So they say that she has killed her child. And now she is full of blood and very hysterical. And the demon pictured there with the skull face is just laughing and taunting her. And then another scene is that of a young girl being approached by two guys at a rave. So they pressure her to drink a sort of alcoholic drink, it's inferred. And when she does, she begins to faint. The narrative then continues in the next room where she's alone in her bedroom, and through her dialogue and acting, we see that she has been date raped. A demon then appears in her room and then starts to mock her, saying that it's all her fault that she got sexually assaulted. And he even infers that she just can't escape sexual abuse because of what her father used to do when she was younger. So the scene ends with the devil offering her a knife and telling her that she'd be better off dead. She does take the knife, slit her wrist, and fake blood pouring all over her arms, and does this dramatic death scene. So the Left Behind series might be a little less disturbing than the Hell House. So this was a popular book series in the early 2000s. And basically they do a fictionalized, but I'm using this term here quite broadly because a lot of white evangelicals do actually believe that Left Behind depicts a very real end of the world scenario, but I'll use the fictionalized since this is considered fiction for most people. So it does depict the end of the world as believed by evangelicals. So the story follows that the end of the world is essentially happening. And one day, our protagonist wakes up and he finds that a good portion of the world has sort of disappeared, and gone to the kingdom of heaven to be with Jesus. And now the ones that are remaining on the earth are considered the unfaithfuls. And they must prove their worth by fighting against the Antichrist as he rises to power and prove themselves worthy before Jesus comes back to earth. So, what precedes here is a sort of violent, gritty war story filled with plenty of gun violence, body horror, and monstrous figure. So, the series is also very infamous for its anti Catholic rhetoric. So in the book, Catholics have been left behind, meaning that they weren't Christian enough. And in addition to that, many of the remaining unfaithful Catholics join the Antichrist, becoming sort of monstrous pawns that must be defeated by our heroic protagonists. So now that we have the proper context, we can talk about The Conjuring and its sequel. So, for those unfamiliar with the Conjuring movies, it follows Ed and Lorraine Warren. These are real life Catholic demonologists who were very active in the 1970s and 80s. And each film is about one of their cases. Lorraine Warren has even been involved in the first two movies before her death in 2019. So I have a picture here of the real life like Ed and Lorraine Warren from the 1970s. So the first two movies of the franchise were written by Chad and Carrie Hayes. I don't know their specific denomination. I don't think that is public knowledge at this point. But they do, basically, they are very conservative Christians from what I can read from their interviews. And they have admitted that the films were based upon Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. And I'm going to read to you right here what that verse is. So, quote, "For we fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and dominions and powers of air unseen. So put the armor of God." In addition to this, the first film was also screen tested to a Christian audience. And the feedback and criticisms from that screen test were put into the film. So the film was actually changed with this Christian audience's feedback. So these films are very religious films. And I want to argue that although they are very religious, that they function most like evangelical horror fiction. So like The Hell House, like Left Behind, and like The Chick Tracts, the politics and religious worldviews of these films are very much tied to Christian nationalist ideology. And just like most of evangelical horror fiction. So for the remainder of this presentation, I want to take a look at 5 tropes in The Conjuring 1 and 2 that are commonly found in evangelical horror fiction. So trope number 1, anti-skepticism and the evangelical truth. So in the world of The Conjuring, skepticism is very dangerous. And quite frankly, there's no room for any skepticism or atheism because it just might be the death of you. So, as we saw with Chick Tracts and the Hell House, the world as imagined by evangelicals is one of conflict between God and the devil. So, remember the praying grandmother in the Chick Tract? Well, she was the one that ultimately saved her daughter through prayer. Remember the people doing the non-Christian things in the Hell House? Well, one of them regretted it, and the other one died. So going against Christian moral corrupts you. And The Conjuring sort of continues this narrative. So in Kevin Wetmore's analysis of The Conjuring, he talks about the world of The Conjuring as having its own idea of reality and truth, one governed by conservative Christian ideals. And in the second Conjuring, the Hodgkins family are portrayed as a very busy middle class family. They're more preoccupied by their finances than any religious obligations. And when Janet, the child, the youngest child actually of the family, takes an interest to the Ouija board, there's really no one to tell her of the possible dangers, and thus she is possessed by this evil entity. And as the film progresses, the audience are firmly in the perspective of the Warrens. There's never any doubt in the audience minds that the demon doesn't exist. And when the reporter tries to undermine the Warrens' investigation by giving the explanation that Janet might actually not be possessed, sorry, and there might actually just be a psychological explanation, maybe she's acting out for attention, the audience know that she's wrong because we become Christian insiders ourselves. And the way in which the film is framed gives us the idea that skepticism is foolish at best and dangerous at worst. And ignoring the situation could lead to the death of Janet. So we have the idea that this film sort of trains us to think like white evangelicals. We understand that the world of The Conjuring, the only solution to these problems are conservative Christian solution. Yes, conservative Christian solutions. And in the first Conjuring, we're told that the Perron family is pretty ambivalent to religious obligation. And while they do believe in God, they don't really attend church or they don't participate in religion within the family home. So the solution is very simple, as Ed Warren tells us, is just to attend church and just become more religious. So, trope number two is individualism and the distrust of Catholic religious institution. So, even though Ed and Lorraine Warren were devoted Catholics, the first and second Conjuring films don't seem too keen on the idea of Catholicism. And I would argue that the third one, however, is pretty much Catholic horror film. But that's like another presentation for another day. So, as we've seen with Left Behind, evangelical horror fiction can actually be pretty anti Catholic. And many evangelical televangelists like Pat Robertson have often stated that the Pope is sort of demonic, and there's this whole history of the Pope being the secret Antichrist. There's also the idea of that Catholic institutions are sort of corrupted liberal institutions and they go against God. So, all in all, many evangelicals believe that Catholics aren't real Christians. So, in The Conjuring 2's main villain, Valak, pictured here, so she is sort of an ancient demon disguised as a Catholic nun. The decision to make the main villain a nun is not a coincidence. So, the idea that beloved Catholic figures might be demonic is a trope often found in evangelical horror fiction. So, in the chick track, Why is Mary Crying, for an example, you see Catholics praying to the Virgin Mary. But however, the chick track goes on to say that while Catholics might think that they are praying to the Virgin Mary, they're actually being tricked by the devil. And since evangelicals do believe that you should only pray to Jesus, the track explains that Catholics are being tricked by the devil himself to pray to a sort of demonic anti-Mary. And thus, it is explained at the end that Mary is crying because although she loves Catholics, she doesn't want them to pray to her, and they should just follow evangelical doctrine and pray to Jesus instead. So, Catholic institutions are very undermined in the first film as well. Ed and Lorraine Warren tried to get approval for an exorcist by the Catholic Church. So the film makes a point that the bureaucracy of the church will ultimately take too long. So Ed and Lorraine Warren go against Catholic law and they perform an unofficial exorcism. So they, of course, they do succeed. And the film ends with Ed getting a call from Catholic authorities stating that the exorcism has been approved. And then basically tells Lorraine, and Lorraine says, nice timing. So this might seem all pretty tame for anti-Catholic imageries, but the film sort of uses Catholicism and Catholic institutions to make another very popular Christian right point, which is that individualism is better than the collective. So remember when we talked about the Christian rights coalescing with the Tea Party movement? Well, one of the defining things is that the Christian right started to absorb more economic policies. And this is showcased in the first Conjuring movie through its dismissal of Catholic institutions, I would argue. So the film prizes hyper individualism. It showcases that the Warrens don't really need Catholic authorities or any institutions to save people. They're more than capable of making spiritual decisions on their own because they have protection from Jesus himself. Through their own personal relationship with Jesus, they're able to make these very spiritual decisions on their own. So there's no need for oversight from the church in the Conjuring films. And really, the institutions, through their elaborate bureaucracy, as portrayed in The Conjuring, are just really playing into the devil's hands. If it takes too long to accept an exorcism, then is it really helping the people? And this is sort of the thinking that the Conjuring films are sort of going for. So trope number 3 is Christian masculinity and the Christian father. So in The Conjuring and The Conjuring 2, building a strong familial unit is the Warrens' main goal. So the two main families of the Conjuring films, the Perrons and the Hodgsons, are missing a sort of strong Christian father figure. So when the Warrens suspect demonic presences, they come sort of live with the families. And that's where they show them how to lead with a strong Christian morals and become this very Christian family unit. So Ed Warren sort of becomes the pivotal father figure that either replaces the absent or weak father. So in the first Conjuring, Roger Perron is portrayed as an absent father, one that is never really at home. And most importantly, he is a father that doesn't really lead his household with strong Christian values. So when Ed and Lorraine first enter the Perron home, Roger tells them that they're not really a church-going family. And to which Ed replies, well, you might want to start. With Ed coming in, he's sort of staying into the home. He embodies the Christian father archetype. And this sort of completes the family unit, and eventually they save the family from the evil Bathsheba with the unofficial exorcism. So the second film is even more explicit in its portrayal of the Christian father, I would argue. The Hodgsons do not have a father at all, so they are quite literally the quintessential broken family. And when Ed comes to help, he is portrayed as very like fatherly towards the children. So there's this scene pictured here on the slide where he picks up the guitar and sings an Elvis song. a figure associated with masculinity of a nostalgic bygone era of American culture. However, Ed also embodies the Christian fatherly masculine archetype when he sort of is seen helping around the house. So he fixes the Hodgson sink, their washing machine, and in this very important scene, he tells Janet, the young possessed child of the film, how to fight the demonic entity through the belief in God. So by having a strong belief in God, you are able to ultimately overcome the demonic possession. So, throughout these films, there's this linking of Ed with the fatherly Christian presence that sort of completes this heterosexual family unit. So, trope number 4, we have evangelical women and the monstrous female. So, while the role of masculinity in these films is very important in the world of The Conjuring, so is the role of femininity. So, thus, the role of women in The Conjuring and its sequel is twofold. On the one hand, you have the transgressive women, the evil entities that provide the villains of the stories. And on the other hand, you have Lorraine Warren, the film's prime example of Christian womanhood. So in evangelical horror fiction, it's always the women and the girls that get brutally punished for straying away from conservative Christian values. And in the Hell House, we've seen it's the teen girls' characters that endure some of the most gruesome acts we've seen, such as the sexual abuse, the abortion, and the suicide. And this comes into question for the evangelical horror fiction essentially is that the female essence is weak and is more prone to demonic possession and violence. So, in her seminal book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Carol Clover argues that possession films are explicitly gendered. So, saying that, quote, it is not just the centrality of the female body and the interest in its passages and interiors and its capacity to accommodate alien intrusion that mark the possession film as somehow feminine. But the fact that the male psyche slash body is understood in like terms and its story told with reference to the internal space of a woman. So, simply put, here, Carol Clover highlights the way possession films have a particular interest in the female body and the idea of that body being physically penetrated by demonic forces. So, men, usually priests and other religious authorities, are then the ones that have to investigate, examine, and voyeuristically tend to the female bodies in hopes to help them. So The Conjuring and The Conjuring 2 certainly fit this idea. But there's another piece to this puzzle, actually. And this is the idea of the monstrous feminine by Barbara Creed, which she argues that female monsters are often, so female monsters such as like the possessed women or witches are often have exaggerated and very grotesque feminine features that are deemed or that are regulated heavily in patriarchal society. So, as an example, in the first Conjuring, the evil entity is called Bathsheba. She is a witch who made a suicide pact with Satan. And when Bathsheba possesses Carolyn, the matriarch of the Perron family, she transforms Carolyn into this animalistic woman, one that vomits blood, rips off a piece of the police officer's neck, and speaks in a raspy demonic voice. And in the second film, when it's revealed that the true villain of the story is Valak, the demonic nun, again, we see her appearance as very animalistic. She bears sharp teeth, yellow eyes, claws, and roars like a feral beast. So in both films, it's the women and girls that get possessed as a punishment for not adhering to Christian values. In Carolyn's case, she's punished for not fostering her children with conservative Christian values, and in Janet's case, she deviates from said values, acting out in school, not being this very good archetypal daughter figure, right? And ultimately playing with the Ouija board. So in their possessed forms, they get physically punished. They get burned, they get slashed, they get this feeling extremely ill, and they eject blood. Now, these women are very much juxtaposed to Lorraine Warren, which I would say is like the quintessential Christian right woman. So the film prizes the Lorraine Warren as this very conservative Christian woman. Lorraine is a loving wife and mother. She's extremely religious and is happily married in a heterosexual marriage. Lorraine, unlike the other women in the film, is able to fight off many encounters with the demonic because she upholds these values. And in the home, she, like Ed Warren, encourages the women to do the same because the main goals of the Warrens and of Lorraine is essentially to strengthen the decaying American heterosexual family unit. So before I go further into this topic, there will be discussion of abortion in this whole topic. So feel free to mute if you are sensitive to this topic. There won't be any images shown this time. So abortion comes up a lot in evangelical horror fiction. We've seen it in The Hell House, but it's also a staple of chick tracts as well. In the chick tract Who Murdered Clarice, a detective is sort of searching for the killer of an aborted fetus. Um, and again, the abortion or the investigation of the abortion is very framed as an Agatha Christie style murder mystery, emphasizing again what many evangelical horror fiction tends to believe is that abortion is murder. So the Christian detective in the chick tract also states that Satan loves to destroy children, a common white evangelical talking point. And we see this in The Conjuring, the first one more specifically. So this is when the mother of the family, of the Perron family, Carolyn, gets possessed by Bathsheba. Bathsheba here embodies this sort of anti-Christian mother, the one who is the murderer of babies, of children. And the goal when she possesses Carolyn is to murder her daughter with a pair of scissors. So allusions to abortion as murder is furthered in the film's climax. And while Ed ultimately performs the unofficial exorcism, it's actually Lorraine's words that she says to Carolyn that actually defeats Bathsheba. So Lorraine, in this pivotal scene, tells Carolyn to think of her children and the love she has for them, and how empty and how spiritually empty she would feel without her daughter. And then Carolyn, through these words, is sort of there's a flashback sequence where they're like this happy white heterosexual family on the beach with the father there who's been very absent in the film up until this point. They're all there sort of laughing, being very happy at the beach. So this is supposed to be this sort of memory. The thing with this scene is that this type of rhetoric is often used by Christian right activists to argue against abortion. Christian right activists love to talk about the spiritual void that comes with abortions. And they often get eyewitness accounts of people telling them that they shouldn't or that they regretted aborting their fetus. So, like Lorraine, these people sort of highlight the spiritual void that comes after an abortion. But again, Lorraine's words to Carolyn are what ultimately brings her back. So it's this very affirming of abortion is murder narrative. And again, we see that Lorraine's purpose here is to strengthen the family unit once again. So, what now? Well, in the current political context of the United States, where are evangelical horror fiction narratives and tropes now? Well, I would say that evangelical horror cinema is not as popular as it once was, and that might be surprising to people. But this doesn't mean that there aren't any evangelical horror fiction narrative in other facets. So when I wrote the article, the QAnon conspiracy theories were everywhere on the news and social media. And for those unfamiliar, QAnon is this sort of set conspiracies about devil worshipping elites. So I've seen a lot of like Hollywood elites like Tom Hanks and Oprah, and Democratic Party elites like Hillary and Bill Clinton. And essentially, it goes that they are kidnapping, killing, and drinking the blood of babies in satanic rituals. The idea is that they are trying to take in a sort of substance in the blood of the babies. I think it's called adrenochrome or something along those lines. And it's supposed to make them sort of more powerful. So again, this is very supernatural. This is very, you have the anti-abortion narrative creeping up again. You have the idea of Satan, the horror aspect. It's supposed to be fearful. This is very much evangelical horror at its core. So although no one has really made a horror film about this topic just yet, but I do hope that someone in the near future does because I feel that it's just ripe for the pickings. Um, it shows that like evangelical horror fiction narratives can be everywhere, and they're not necessarily always fiction. They can start out as fiction, but then these narratives sort of become kind of like doctrines in a way. And we've seen Trump sort of continue to peddle these conspiracies even today. His idea of talking about saving the children and being like the president for the children is all feeding into these sort of QAnon conspiracy theories. So on the surface, the Conjuring films, they might be secular films. They are not distributed by Christian distribution, and nor are they marketed as explicitly Christian films. But I hope that I have shown throughout this presentation the ways in which evangelical narratives and Christian nationalist themes can show up in horror films, even if they might be subtle.